Hello, I'm going to give a book review of this book, Dangerfield's Promise by Terrance Newby. This is an excellent book, but you may be wondering, why should I read a book about events of over 170 years ago? What possible relevance does that have today? I hope after my book review you'll see some of the parallels I draw to even our situation today. But first, who was Dangerfield? His full name was Dangerfield Newby. He was a blacksmith. He was a father. He was a husband. He was born a slave and was freed by his owner. But he found himself in a situation where he was freed, but the love of his life, Harriet, his wife, was not freed. She was still a slave across the border in the slave state. He also had multiple children, I believe it was 5, who were also enslaved. He worked diligently to try to use the current system back then to purchase them out of slavery. He agreed upon a price, $1,000 for his wife, Harriet. And, of course, when he gained about $750 to purchase her, he was getting close. What did the owner do? He upped the price. He was really desperate for him, and I have a picture of him in the year of his death of 1859 during the Harper's Ferry raid. I see in that picture a picture of a man who's very weary. He's weary of working, trying to work within the system, only to have the carpet pulled out from under him. I also see a man of great strength and competence. Let me give a little bit more background on what the Harper's Ferry raid was. The Harper's Ferry raid was in 1859. This was 2 years before the actual Civil War. This was an arsenal in just near, not very far from Washington, D.C., full of weapons. And there was a famous abolitionist preacher named John Brown. And I have a picture of John Brown. And he led a raid to capture the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry is in a location that is very vulnerable, and it seems to be a strange place for an arsenal. It turns out during the Civil War it actually changed hands many times. It's down in a valley, and so all an opposing army would have to do is bring cannons and put them on the tops of the hills around the crossing of a river, which was Harper's Ferry, and they really had a tremendous advantage over the defenders. That was the case in 1859 when it had munitions and weapons like pikes and some guns. The idea that John Brown had would be that if they obtained those weapons, they could take them into the southern states, playing the drums, a beat of freedom, and that enslaved people would come to them, get weapons, and be able to defend themselves and overturn slavery. Well, it didn't turn out that way. Ironically, they did capture Harper's Ferry. Dangerfield was obviously a key member of the raiding party. He was depended upon to be a key scout and watch out. He was also successful in defending the other raiders from attacks from townspeople. But here's a spoiler alert. He was killed tragically during the raid by not the soldiers that were sent to put down the raid, by the townspeople who were trying to take back the arsenal. Hard to relate to now, but back at this time, the southern slave states were scared to death of something just like this happening. They were scared that the enslaved people would be armed in an insurrection, and they knew that anything like that would result in great bloodshed and tragedy. And so the townspeople were willing to attack the raiders to try to retake it from them. So this is not what the book is about. The book is about Dangerfield as a person. And I had heard of him decades ago, learning about the Harper's Ferry raid and John Brown. But I didn't know him as a person, and that's what this book is about. What was he like as a person? Well, his wife, Harriet, was impressive. She was fully literate, and she actually wrote him a number of letters while he was out trying desperately to generate enough money to purchase her and his 5 children. She wrote very loving letters, which are all printed in this book, which gives you an idea of the motivation he had and why he may have joined something like this. Ironically, she was obviously a person of great education for the times, and this, in a very terribly cynical way, made her more difficult to purchase out of slavery than had she been simply a farmhand and a manual laborer. So after years of trying to generate enough money, getting close and having the rug pulled out from him, he felt, I believe, he had no choice but to join this raid and try to free her through an insurrection against the slave states. Now, the book faithfully reproduces those letters from Harriet, his wife, to him, but the author has not had access to his letters to her, but he did, I believe, a great job of putting into the letters that he believed Dangerfield would have said to her to elicit the letters that she wrote back to him. So it's a wonderful way to get to know him as a person, which makes the end result all the more tragic and all the more depressing. We see here, even today, people who see other people in unjust situations and could care less and do nothing to help them. Back in 1859, I'm sure that Dangerfield was not the only person in a similar situation where a slave owner could pull the rug out on somebody after years and years of hard work. Of course, this is about the time of the Dred Scott decision, which really further dehumanized slaves and people who were trying to gain their freedom. Even today, we have people who don't care about the unjust circumstances of other people and don't see them as human beings, but merely as labels. So if you do read this book, be prepared for a little bit of sad ending when Dangerfield is killed. But I like to think of what's really happened over the last 170 years as a more upbeat ending to the book. It turns out that the author of this case, Terrance C. Newby, is Terry Newby, my friend. We are both intellectual property attorneys. We've spoken together at continuing legal education training for lawyers in Minnesota. Terry's a wonderful person and has a very admirable career here in Minnesota in intellectual property law at a very prestigious law firm and is highly regarded by his colleagues. But during this John Brown raid, one of the interesting footnotes in history is the army that was assembled, or the troops that were assembled to quell this rebellion, were led by Robert E. Lee himself, the famous general during the Civil War of the South. But he also had a lieutenant, Jeb Stuart, who was later a famous cavalry officer in the Confederate cavalry during the Civil War, and that was killed near the end of the war, I believe at Petersburg, I'm not sure. But ironically, Dangerfield Newby had a brother who was killed fighting for the Union at about the same time. So what's the connection? What's the connection between Jeb Stuart and Dangerfield Newby? Well, it turns out that Jeb Stuart was only in Washington, D.C. at the time of the raid because he was trying to seek a patent, a piece of intellectual property. He had an invention for a device to hold the reins while a cavalry soldier used both hands to fire his rifle. He was only exploring the possibility for getting a patent because he had hoped to sell each of those devices to every cavalry soldier in the United States Army, which would have made him a very wealthy person. I guess the happy ending to this whole chain of events is that unlike Terry Newby, who had success in the intellectual property field, Jeb Stuart never obtained his patent. Events rapidly overcame him, and he never applied for a United States patent. And we don't know whether he applied for a Confederate patent because the Confederate Patent Office burned down just at the end of the war. So I highly recommend this book, despite the fact that you'll have to steel yourself for a very, very sad ending. But it's a wonderful opportunity to see a historic figure as a person, to understand the unjust events that caused him to take up arms against his country, and to better understand how to avoid situations where you just don't even look when there's an injustice, and the danger of ignoring that with other people. Thank you for sitting through the book review. I really appreciate it, and I hope to supplement this with an interview with the author. Thank you.